Okay, so this week I've put together a brief PowerPoint which covers the first three chapters of the book Blur by Bill Kovac and Tom Rosenstiel. So I've asked you to read these first three chapters. These authors have many years of experience as journalists working at places like the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and they've also written a lot on journalism. They've written other books about journalism. The Elements of Journalism is another book that they've written, which is often used in courses. This book is more about news literacy and how do we make sense of information that we see, that we read, that we view. And so chapter by chapter they kind of break this down. I think they do a very good job of trying to give you the tools that you'll need to sort out these different types of information. Chapter 1 begins with a discussion of 3 Mile Island. I'm sure none of you really, you might have read about this. I'm sure none of you could remember this because it's even before my time. I'm 42, but it was before it happened when I was a very small child, and I remember people talking about it as I was growing up, but I was too young to know what was happening at the time. But in any case, 3 Mile Island was this scare, this nuclear scare that happened. And so they go through like how would this happen today? Like how would it be reported? What would happen? And just ask yourself as you're reading this introduction, does this scenario seem plausible, what they're saying? And also, they ask this question: is the traditional media right now, are they doing a good job of reporting events like this? You might also think about how it was reported at the time and how it would be reported now, and what the differences are. Did we gain things by the way things are reported now, and do we lose some things too? So these are the kinds of questions that the authors are asking as they go through it. On page 5, they even say how ABC, the network, decided never to use an adjective that was not used by authorities. So this is one good way of trying to report the news as it happened, to not really embellish, just to use only things that the authorities are telling you. This also could have some drawbacks. That might be that what if the authorities are not really telling the whole story? But in this case, this was an emergency, and they made the decision that they should only listen to the authorities and not go beyond that. They should only report things in the way the authorities did. And on page 6, they talk about what the topic of this book is: how to know what we should believe. And what will the role of the old press be, or if you want to call it the old press? What is the role of the press as these different forms continue to gain traction? And this is just the way journalism is done now in all these different modes. And so what will the role of traditional journalism be as we move forward? I've also put on the course guide this retro report from 3 Mile Island. I think it's a really good report, so you could look at that, and we'll have some discussions about that on the board for the course. But that retro report gives you a real sense of what these guys are talking about in this first chapter, in how exactly this happened, how it was reported at the time. We're talking about something that happened decades ago, and it's very different from how we would see it reported now. So watch the video, because it really does give you a very good sense of how it was being reported on television. And this is how things were disseminated at that time. Very different from how you would see it now, in many ways, obviously. So have a look at that, and then we'll have some discussions on the board as well. In chapter 2, the authors get into different transformations of information that have happened through the ages. They start out with the written word. They move on very quickly. On page 15, they're talking about the printing press. Just to read a brief quote on page 15 under that printing press section, if you have the book in front of you. Gutenberg's printing press made it possible to quickly produce mass quantities of books and pamphlets. At the time he developed his press, around 1450, it took a monk roughly a year to hand copy a single Bible. In its first full year of production, Gutenberg's press printed 180 Bibles. So this is something that transformed things pretty quickly. And it also says within 50 years, millions of books had been printed. So we go from hand copying a single Bible over the course of a year to producing 180 of them to within several decades or 5 decades, millions of them are being printed and distributed all over the world. So this is a dramatic change. I mean, now it doesn't sound like much at all to us. So what? There were 180 books in a year. It sounds like nothing. But at the time, it was a huge transformation in Europe. And so we see these kinds of transformations. We're seeing one now. And they're talking about different ones, though, in the history. So they get into the telegraph then on page 16, how this really was the birth of news, the authors say. That the telegraph enabled us to instantaneously know news all around the country. People hadn't been able to do this before, and suddenly, because of the telegraph, news could travel electronically. It could go over the cables, and you would know if you were in Texas, you could know what was happening in Maine or something like that, or in New England. And so this is the birth of news in the way that the authors understand it and the way that they're describing it. And then radio is another big transformation that they discuss. People could now hear events as they unfold. You don't even need to know how to read in order to get the news in this way. You don't need to read a telegraph note. You could just listen to the radio and listen to a report, and you can understand what's happening. An example of this that they give is the President Franklin Roosevelt at the time giving his fireside chats, which was a kind of discussion. He would speak directly to people on the radio each week, and this would give them an opportunity to hear the president, and it would give him an opportunity to really appeal directly to the people around the country. The president still does this. He has a weekly address. It's something that you can find on the web, but you can find it on the White House website. It doesn't have the kind of impact that it did at this time, because this was a new technology at the time, and many people would listen and tune into this to find out what was happening. Now there are so many other ways to get the news that people are probably not listening to these as much, but it's still something that the president continues to do each week. Now moving on to television and digital technology. The authors talk about how just 20 years after radio made its debut, we had the beginnings of television. Television obviously had an enormous impact on the way people would start to receive their information, start to receive news, and this eventually would lead to a decline in the influence of newspapers over time. You had newspapers as being the most important way that people, and the primary way that people got news, and people still read them now as well, but television kind of ate into that audience. If you could just watch a broadcast, as with radio, you would just listen, but here you're watching a news broadcast, and there's lots of video images, and this is eating into the audience that newspapers have. There's overlap there too, of course, but they're saying that this led to the decline of influence in newspapers. On page 21, then they talk about cable news, and now this is something different. Before cable news, before the beginnings of cable news, it was a nightly newscast, which you still have. If you want to, you can sit and watch this 6 or 7 o'clock news each night, and the 3 networks will still do this. But on these cable news networks, as we all know, things like CNN, which is still around, was launched in 1980, but at this time it was the first cable news network. So they're having this continuous reporting of the news. And then you have to ask yourself, the authors say, is there more stuff happening now than there used to be? There are more events to report on. Are there things worthy of the news in a 24/7 news cycle? It's a good question to ask, and you have to wonder if this has affected the quality of news. what's going on at any given point of the day. If you turn on Fox News or CNN or MSNBC, they're always reporting something. They're usually talking about different things. But whether or not they're newsworthy is another question. Is this, and they ask, is this kind of reporting of continuous news or the creation of continuous news? Is it really news? Is it really a good thing for people or for the government? And what problems might it pose? These are good questions to think about, and we'll get to those kinds of questions as we continue through this book. Then on page 22, they continue by talking about digital technology and consumer choice. And they have some interesting statistics there in the middle of the page from 2000 and 2008. This is a little dated now because we're in 2016, but in 2000 they're saying 46% of adults use the internet, and then 8 years later it was 74%. Now it's close to 100%, most likely. And then the percentages of high-speed internet, the percentages of cell phones, the percentage of people using Wi-Fi, all of these things were very small in 2000. They had grown a lot by 2008. Now these things are almost universal, that people have access to this kind of constant access to the web, as we all know. So they're discussing in these next few pages the rise of the internet and the fall of print. And they think about, why is he saying this is happening? What is the role of advertising in all of this? And how is that different from how it used to be? I mean, newspapers always had some sorts of advertising, but they're saying that this is different, that this is we've entered a different kind of age, and we need to think about how we're going to handle that, as we've seen in some of our other readings too. So advertising has been there in journalism, and what might the difference be now? I mean, we even see things like, which we'll talk about later, like native ads and stuff like that, and how does that fit in this kind of advertising? And so they're setting up the stage for the types of questions they'll be asking throughout the course of this book. In chapter 3, the authors begin a discussion of how to know what it is you're looking at. And they call this the way of skeptical knowing. And on page 32, they have a series of these 6 really good questions that I think you can apply this not only to news, but to any kind of research you're looking at. So at the top of page 32, if you have your book, you can look at these or highlight them. I think they're questions that are worth asking about universally, about almost any kind of information you're looking at, whether it's research, whether it's news, or whatever it might be. But number 1, what kind of content am I encountering? 2, is the information complete, and if not, what is missing? 3, who or what are the sources, and why should I believe them? 4, what evidence is presented, and how was it tested or vetted? And 5, what might be an alternative explanation or understanding? And 6, am I learning what I need to? So throughout this book, they'll be getting into detail about these 6 questions, but here they are, and they're good questions to ask. What kind of evidence is being presented is particularly important, and we'll get to that as well. But it's one thing to just make a claim and to just state something, and it's another to back it up with evidence. And this is really the crux of how to do a research paper too. But they're also talking about it in terms of the news here. They also get into the types of journalism in this part of the book. And the first is the journalism of verification. This is a traditional model of news, as they say, and it puts a high value on accuracy and on context for the news. It's focused on completeness. It has multiple sources that can be verified. And these are stories, the kind of stories that are sort of the gold standard when you're looking at the news. They don't attempt to say what is not known or to have all of the answers to something. They're just presenting the news as it happened. And so this is a traditional way of doing the news. The authors mention at the beginning of this chapter Homer Bigart, who was a reporter in Vietnam, and he was someone who was an exemplar of this form of journalism. Someone who would get on the ground and actually see what was taking place, even if it contradicted the official narrative of what the military was saying. Um, he had a better he had better knowledge of what occurred because he was there. He would actually go into the field and see what happened, and then report back on it. Using all of these things, using multiple sources, being as complete as possible, being as accurate as possible, and not trying to go beyond the actual story and infer things, but rather to just say what is known, and not pretending to have all the answers. Um, these kinds of things are, this is just a model of how to do good journalism. It's really a model of how to do good research of any kind. To be as complete as possible, to use those sources, to be cautious and as accurate as possible, and to not extrapolate answers when you don't really have them. So this is the journalism of verification, and you can often see this in good news writing. I mean, you'll see it in the New York Times, you'll see it in other newspapers, you'll see it sometimes in lengthy reports on television. And you always look for these kind of earmarks of it to know that's what you're looking at. A newer model of journalism that the authors get into after that, on page 38, is the journalism of assertion. And just like it sounds, this type of journalism is not as reliable probably as verification. It's someone asserting something, just as the title says. This is a different model, and the value that's placed here is not necessarily always on accuracy or completeness or those sources. The value here is placed on immediacy. What do we immediately know? And this can be a valuable kind of news too. An example that they use of this is CNN, just reporting on what's happening from the scene. You've all seen forms of this. You could go on their website and see what they're reporting at the current time right now. And the idea is to just get the news out there, just to get it out as quickly as possible. Now, because it's so immediate, it does have value. It tells you what's happening as it occurs. There are a lot of examples of this that they talk about. What's happening in a current criminal trial that's high profile. What's happening in sports, what kind of press conferences are going on. Also, if there was an accident or a disaster or things like that. You all know what they're getting at here. I mean, this is an important kind of news, and it has a lot of value. I mean, we see a lot of it all over. I mean, we see citizens doing a form of this too when these kinds of things happen in public. People might record things with their phone. They might upload them to YouTube or Twitter and things like that, and it's clear that the kind of value that this kind of news gathering has. The authors say that this will also have its drawbacks. I mean, you can see forms of this that are really not well done, or they're misleading. As an example of this, they talk about talking head journalism, which you'll see this on a lot. Everyone knows this and has probably seen some form of it on either CNN or MSNBC. The authors on page 40 to 41 talk about Meet the Press, and they give different exchanges between, there's one in particular here with Rachel Maddow and House Majority Leader at the time, Dick Armey. And in this case, you have Dick Armey asserting something that MoveOn.org, which is a liberal website, had run ads comparing George W. Bush, who was president at the time, to Hitler. And Maddow says they didn't do that. This is the top of page 41. Armey insists they did do it. They didn't do that, Maddow repeated. And so this is kind of back and forth that you'll see a lot of times, people just asserting things. How do we know which is correct or not, which is true? And this is a mild form of it they're talking about, but we see a lot of different cases of this, where people are just put on TV to talk, and they'll just say things without any kind of verification. So they're calling this the journalism of assertion. Everyone's seen it. They're just giving it this label and telling you to look out for these kinds of things. And they also say that, the challenge of this for people doing this kind of news is that this technology is so powerful. The technology is so important that you can't miss out on it. You have to use it, but you also have to be very careful when you're using it. There's this kind of bias built into the technology. It's very immediate and it has value, but how exactly are we going to use it in a way that's not misleading? So these are things to think about as we move through the rest of the book as well, and also as you look at different news sources that you might use for your research. Just consider, is this verification or assertion type journalism? Is it a basically, is it a reliable source or not? Next, the authors move on page 45 into what they're calling the journalism of affirmation. Now, this is different from verification, and it's careful use of vetted sources, and its reliance on accuracy, or its prizing of accuracy, and it's different from assertion, which is trying to be as immediate as possible. Affirmation is partisan news. Now, we've all seen this as well. I mentioned Fox News and MSNBC before, and CNN as well. These are places where you might see forms of this kind of partisan news. You might see it anywhere. I mean, we see examples of it all over. I mention here the Colbert Report because it's off the air now. He's moved on to different kinds of things, but that show did a really brilliant job in lampooning this sort of affirmation journalism. The news anchor here, instead of trying to remain impartial or even pretend to be impartial, it becomes a pundit. And they might pretend to be impartial, but usually they even drop that pretense. They're clearly on one side or the other of an issue. You know, they're now we're seeing it with different candidates that they may be. They may have certain feelings for, they may back or support a specific candidate, and it's often quite clear when you watch these kinds of newscasts. You know, the Colbert Report was making fun of the show The O'Reilly Factor, which is a form of this kind of journalism of affirmation, where the audience already knows that they're going to agree with what's being said, and they put it on for that reason, really. What you're learning from that is, I mean, who knows if you're learning anything new or not, but you know that it has a distinctive point of view. I mean, Bill O'Reilly doesn't even he doesn't even argue that point. He bills himself as a conservative. He says that he's independent, but that he's a conservative person, and that's how he'll spin the news. Or he says that he's not spinning it, but that's how the news is going to be on a channel like that. Rachel Maddow on MSNBC is the opposite. You know, it's just the flip side of the same form of journalism. If you're tuning into that, you know you're not going to get a conservative viewpoint. It'll probably be much more liberal. And there are written forms of this too. I mean, it's not only on television. There's also printed forms. A magazine like the National Review has a conservative viewpoint, and people who read that know that they do. And then there are liberal ones like The Nation is one example, but it's not anything new to television, but it's something, another form of journalism that the authors say you should beware of, or you should at least know that this is what you're watching. It's kind of opinion journalism, where the person delivering the news is also offering an op-ed kind of thing. It's often about their personality, and they're almost seen as entertainers in a way. So the authors get into this as the book goes on, but they say this is something to be wary of as well. On page 50, they get into a shorter discussion of what they call interest group journalism. And this is the type of journalism that you'll see from time to time. There are websites devoted to this kind of journalism. It's usually funded by political groups. So again, as with affirmation, I mean, it's different from journalism of affirmation, but it has a specific agenda that it's going to try to promote. Some might argue that Fox News or MSNBC are also a form of this, but this is a different kind of journalism. There are things like think tanks and other outlets that are well financed and have a distinct political view, and this is where a lot of this kind of interest group journalism will originate. Um, Examples of this are a website like Big Government, which is a conservative family of websites. You might be familiar with this, including Breitbart.com is part of that. And they have a specific point of view um, that they're trying to get across. There are other sites like this as well that on the liberal side, of course. TruthDig is one example of it, which is a more liberal kind of site. But so interest group journalism, one way to know that that's what you're looking at is just looking at the About Us tab on the website. I mean, sometimes they'll be transparent about it, other times they won't be, and it's hard to even know that you're looking at interest group journalism. But a lot of this work is often political in nature. It's hard to even it's hard to say that it's really accurate because it's not really trying to present things in a necessarily in an accurate way. It's more trying to persuade you to a specific political point of view. The authors end this discussion of different types of journalism by talking about a few different ones: aggregation, blogging, and social media, and then hybrid sites. So aggregation is kind of a website that will, as it sounds, it's just collecting different stories on news topics. So you'll see a lot of these. Huffington Post is one example. They just collect all different links to stories. You may have your own feed that you have. I mean, this is primarily now, this is how many people will experience the news or read it, is having their own way to aggregate them through Facebook, through Twitter, or through some other kind of reader that you might use. Having some kind of a feed that sends the news to you. And this could have its own problem too. If we're looking and filtering stuff out ourselves, or we're really getting all the news we need. I mean, if we're filtering out viewpoints we might not agree with, or we're filtering out things that we don't like, I mean, this could be problematic. So all of us are aggregators, they're saying, and we have to be careful about what we choose to read and what we choose to ignore. And what do we include and what do we reject? They talk about this in this section a little bit. And so this is kind of a subjective way of getting the news. They also talk about blogging and social media, and it's obvious that these take many different kinds of forms. I mean, there are personal opinion type blogs. There are very good journalism and political type blogs. They talk about how there are advocacy and public interest kinds of blogs and social media sites, or social media pages. And a lot of traditional outlets are using these forms now. I mean, the New York Times has a really wonderful section of blogs written by different, written by scientists or parents and things like that. So it's just kind of a big net here that we're talking about, and with blogging and social media, I think no matter what your interest is, if it's in technology or science or the arts or whatever it might be, I mean, these can be really good ways of getting recent information and viewpoints about these different things that are going on, or different interests that you might have. They mentioned Boing Boing, which is an interesting one because they cover a lot of entertainment things. They also cover science, and they cover current events. So it's a big mix of things that you might be looking at here. And then they talk about hybrid journalism. I think many of the things we'll look at this semester, many of the things that the authors even talk about, will fall under hybrid journalism. It's hard to say. There are many different kinds of articles that you'll look at, and it's hard to say whether, okay, is this really specifically verification journalism or affirmation, or is it assertion? Sometimes you'll see things that are a combination of all of them together. And that's okay. I mean, that could be maybe that's the direction that things are going, and it's just good to realize that, okay, you can trust certain things about this article, but maybe when if it's not complete enough, or if the person is venturing into opinion a little bit, you have to be wary of that. So this is just another way the authors are suggesting that you have to use these kind of methods or these kind of definitions as you're looking at different articles, just to verify what it is, or just to know for yourself, to skeptically know what it is you're reading. And so by using the techniques like this, or these kind of broad fields, you can kind of get an idea of what the goal of the journalist is, and whether you can trust the article you're reading. And so we'll continue with this as we go through the book.